When people ask me how I ended up inheriting 2 houses at 32, I never tell them the full story. How could I explain that my mother-in-law's attempt to destroy my marriage ended up costing her everything she owned? But I suppose I should start at the beginning, back when I still thought Margaret Thompson was just a slightly overbearing mother who needed time to warm up to me. I met her son Ryan at a charity gala 3 years ago. He was everything I never knew I wanted: brilliant, kind, and completely devoted to helping others through his work as a pediatric surgeon. Our whirlwind romance surprised everyone, especially me. I'd always been cautious with relationships, but something about Ryan felt different. Within 6 months, we were engaged. That's when I first noticed Margaret's peculiarities. A June wedding. She frowned when we announced our date, but the Thompson family always has autumn weddings. It's tradition. She said the word tradition like it was carved in stone, passed down through generations. I tried to explain that June worked better with our schedules. Ryan's hospital had a rotation system that made autumn leaves impossible, and my job as an environmental lawyer had its own demanding timeline. But Margaret wouldn't hear it. Well, she'd sniffed. I suppose some people don't care about family traditions. That was just the beginning. Every wedding decision became a battlefield. The venue wasn't prestigious enough. The flower arrangements weren't traditional enough. My dress wasn't conservative enough. But Ryan stood firmly by my side, supporting every choice we made together. "Don't take it personally," he'd whisper, squeezing my hand under the dinner table during another tense family meal. "Mom's just set in her ways. She'll come around." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But there was something in Margaret's eyes when she looked at me, something that went beyond mere disapproval. It was like she was waiting for me to fail, counting on it even. The wedding itself was beautiful, despite Margaret's predictions of disaster. The June day was perfect, sunny but not too hot, with a gentle breeze that made the garden decorations dance. I'd never seen Ryan look more handsome than when he stood at the altar, tears in his eyes as I walked down the aisle. Even Margaret seemed to have made peace with the situation, or so I thought. She gave a lovely speech at the reception about welcoming me to the family, though her smile never quite reached her eyes. I was too happy to care, floating through the day in a bubble of joy. We'd hired Thomas Chen, an up-and-coming photographer known for his artistic style, to capture everything. He took thousands of photos and hours of video, documenting every moment from getting ready in the morning to our sparkler send-off at night. When he showed us some preview shots on his camera, I knew we'd made the right choice. He captured not just the events but the emotions, the love, the joy, the connection between everyone there. The full album and video will be ready in about 3 weeks, Thomas told us at the end of the night. I'll have everything backed up at my studio, but I always like to give couples a hard drive with all the raw files right away. It's just more personal that way. He handed me a sleek black hard drive, carefully wrapped in tissue paper. I tucked it into my wedding emergency kit, planning to transfer everything to our home computer the next day before we left for our honeymoon. That was my first mistake. The morning after the wedding, we had a farewell brunch at Margaret's house before heading to the airport. Everything was going surprisingly well. Margaret had even made my favorite chocolate chip pancakes, though she couldn't resist commenting that in the Thompson family, we usually have crepes for post-wedding brunch. I'd left my wedding emergency kit on the kitchen counter while we ate, not thinking anything of it. After all, it just contained some makeup, hairpins, and that precious hard drive. When I went to grab it before leaving, I noticed a wet spot on the counter. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Margaret exclaimed, rushing over with a towel. "I must have knocked over my coffee. Let me clean that up for you." My heart stopped when I opened the kit. The hard drive was drenched, coffee dripping from every port. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth in an expression of shock that looked just a little too rehearsed. "Oh no," she gasped. "Did it get damaged?" "Thank goodness, the photographer has backups at his studio." Except he didn't. We found out 2 days into our honeymoon that Thomas's studio had been broken into the night after our wedding. All his equipment was stolen, including the computer with our photos. The police report suggested professional thieves, but they never found any leads. Just like that, every photo and video from our wedding day was gone. Every smile, every tear, every magical moment, lost forever. The only images we had were a few cell phone shots from guests, most of them blurry or poorly lit. Ryan was devastated, but I was suspicious. The timing was too perfect. The break-in at Thomas's studio, Margaret's accidental coffee spill. But I had no proof, and Ryan couldn't believe his mother would do something so cruel. It's just a terrible coincidence, he insisted. Mom would never. I let it go for Ryan's sake, but I started paying more attention to Margaret's behavior. I noticed how she accidentally ruined things that were important to me. My favorite sweater that she offered to wash only to put it in the dryer on high heat. The family recipe book my grandmother left me that got lost when Margaret borrowed it. Small things always with a plausible explanation, but they added up. The real turning point came 6 months after the wedding. Ryan and I had bought our dream home, a beautiful Victorian that needed some work but had incredible potential. Margaret hated it from the moment she saw it. This neighborhood, she'd sneered during her first visit. The Thompsons have always lived in Oakwood Heights. This area is so nouveau riche. I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to point out that her precious Oakwood Heights had been a middle-class neighborhood when she and her husband first moved there. Instead, I focused on renovating our home, turning it into exactly what Ryan and I had envisioned. Then came the call that changed everything. The bank is foreclosing on my house. Margaret sobbed over the phone one evening. Your father's medical bills. I had no choice but to take out a second mortgage, and now I can't keep up with the payments. My father-in-law had passed away 2 years before I met Ryan, after a long battle with cancer. I knew the medical bills had been substantial, but Margaret had always given the impression that everything was handled through insurance and their savings. I don't know what to do, she continued, her voice trembling. I always thought I'd leave this house to Ryan someday. It's been in the Thompson family for 3 generations. That last part wasn't exactly true. Margaret and her husband had bought the house in the 80s, but I let it slide. I was more concerned about the impact this would have on Ryan. He'd grown up in that house, and despite his mother's behavior, I knew he'd be devastated to see her lose it. We'll figure something out, I promised, already running numbers in my head. Our savings were healthy, and my latest environmental case had brought in a substantial bonus. Maybe we could help with a few payments until Margaret got back on her feet. But Margaret had other ideas. You could sell your house, she suggested the next day during an emergency family dinner at her place. It's too big for just the 2 of you anyway. You could move in here with me, help with the mortgage payments. It would be so much more sensible. I nearly choked on my wine. Sell our house? Move in here? Just temporarily, Margaret added quickly, though her eyes said otherwise. Until I get back on my feet. You know this house means everything to me, to the family. Ryan shifted uncomfortably beside me. I could see him wrestling with the desire to help his mother and the knowledge that what she was asking was too much. Before he could speak, I decided to take control of the situation. Let me look over your financial documents, I offered. Maybe there's another solution we haven't considered. Margaret's face went pale. Oh, I couldn't possibly burden you with all that paperwork. It's so complicated. But I insisted, and eventually she agreed to bring her documents to our weekly Sunday dinner. That's when I made my second mistake. I told her exactly when we'd be out of the house the following Saturday, running errands and visiting friends. We came home to find our front door slightly ajar, though nothing appeared to be missing. Nothing except the spare key we'd hidden in a magnetic box under the porch railing, the location of which I'd accidentally revealed to Margaret weeks earlier when using it to let in a repair person. Something about the situation felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't until later that night, when I was going through some papers in my home office, that I realized what had happened. My locked file cabinet, where I kept important documents from my biggest environmental law cases, had been tampered with. To understand what happened next, you need to know about the case I've been working on for the past year. A major development company had been illegally dumping toxic waste in protected wetlands, and I'd gathered enough evidence to not only stop the project but potentially bankrupt the company. The case was set to go to court in 2 months, and the documents in my file cabinet were crucial pieces of evidence. I'd immediately checked the files. Everything looked like it was there, but something felt off. It wasn't until I started really examining the papers that I noticed subtle differences: changed dates, altered figures, missing signatures. Someone had replaced my original documents with expertly forged copies, ones that would fall apart under court scrutiny. My blood ran cold as I realized what this meant. The only person who knew exactly when our house would be empty, who had access to a spare key, and who had a desperate need for money was Margaret. But why would she, Then I remembered a casual comment she'd made months ago about her friend Patricia's son who worked for a development company. The same company I was suing. The pieces started falling into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. I called Thomas Chen that night, our wedding photographer. It took some convincing, but he finally admitted the truth. Margaret had approached him before the wedding, offering to pay triple his usual rate if he'd give her the only copy of our wedding photos and stage a break-in at his studio. He'd agreed, never thinking about the emotional impact it would have on us. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "She said it was for a surprise album she was making. I didn't realize." But I wasn't listening anymore. My mind was racing, thinking about all the little accidents over the past year. The constant undermining, the attempts to drive a wedge between Ryan and me. This wasn't just about a controlling mother-in-law anymore. This was about someone who would stop at nothing to get what she wanted, even if it meant destroying evidence in a major environmental lawsuit. I spent the next week gathering my own evidence, carefully documenting everything. I retrieved security camera footage from our neighbors showing Margaret entering our house the day of the break-in. I got Thomas Chen's confession in writing. I even found the original wedding photos stored in a safety deposit box under Margaret's name. But I didn't confront her immediately. No, I had a better idea. Christmas was coming up, and Margaret always insisted on hosting a big family gathering. This year, she'd get a holiday surprise she'd never forget. Christmas Eve at the Thompson house had always been an elaborate affair. Margaret took pride in decorating every inch of the Victorian home, from the professionally trimmed 12-foot tree in the living room to the handcrafted garlands draped along the staircase. This year was no different, except for the desperation lurking behind her perfect hostess smile. "Karen, darling," Margaret trilled as Ryan and I arrived, pulling me into a hug that felt more like a python's embrace. "I'm so glad you could make it. I was worried you might be too busy with that big case of yours." The way she emphasized big case made my skin crawl, but I smiled back sweetly. "Oh, I wouldn't miss it for the world, especially since you said you have some big announcement to make tonight." That part had been my idea. 2 days ago, I called Margaret and told her Ryan and I had been discussing her financial situation. I hinted that we'd made a decision about selling our house to help her. She practically purred with satisfaction, immediately announcing she'd share the wonderful news with the whole family at Christmas Eve dinner. The house was already full when we arrived. Ryan's Aunt Claire and Uncle James had come from Boston. His cousins Michael and Sarah were there with their spouses and children. Even his elderly grandmother Rose had made the trip from Florida. Margaret had orchestrated everything perfectly, all the witnesses she needed for her moment of triumph. "Everyone's so excited about your announcement," Aunt Claire whispered as she helped me with my coat. "Margaret's been hinting about it all day. Something about you and Ryan making a wonderful sacrifice for family." I just smiled and moved into the living room, where Ryan was already being cornered by his cousins. He shot me a questioning look. I still hadn't told him about my discovery or my plans for tonight. Part of me felt guilty about keeping him in the dark, but I knew he needed to see the truth about his mother for himself. The evening progressed exactly as Margaret had planned. Dinner was served on her best china, each course more elaborate than the last. She'd even hired servers for the evening, a shocking expense for someone supposedly on the brink of financial ruin. I noticed she'd seated Ryan and me on either side of her at the head of the table, positioning herself perfectly for her grand announcement. As dessert was being served, her famous chocolate Yule log, Margaret stood and clinked her glass. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. She was in her element, commanding attention like a conductor before an orchestra. "My dear family," she began, her voice thick with emotion that I now knew was entirely fabricated. "This year has been challenging for me. As some of you know, I've been struggling to keep this beloved family home after George's passing." She dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "But tonight, I have wonderful news. Karen and Ryan have made an incredibly generous decision." This was it, my moment. I stood up before she could continue, pulling out a manila envelope from beside my chair. "Actually, Margaret," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I have an announcement of my own. Several, in fact." The confusion on her face was almost comical. This wasn't part of her script. "Karen dear, perhaps we should." First, I continued as if she hadn't spoken. "I'd like to share these with everyone." I pulled out a stack of photographs. Our wedding photos, the ones that had supposedly been lost. It's amazing what you can find in a safety deposit box at First National Bank, especially one registered to Margaret Thompson. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Margaret's face went pale, but I wasn't done. I also have here a written confession from our wedding photographer, Thomas Chin, detailing how you paid him to destroy our wedding memories. And this, I pulled out more papers, is security footage showing you breaking into our house last week, the same day my case files were tampered with. Karen, what are you talking about? Ryan stood up, his face a mask of confusion and growing concern. I turned to face him, my heart aching for the pain I was about to cause him. Your mother hired someone to forge documents in my environmental law case, Ryan. The same case that's worth millions in damages against the company where her friend Patricia's son works as CEO. Margaret jumped to her feet, her chair screeching against the hardwood floor. These are ridiculous accusations. I would never. Oh, but you did. I cut her off. Just like you never accidentally spilled coffee on our wedding photos. Just like you never accidentally lost my grandmother's recipe book. Just like you're not actually in financial trouble at all. I pulled out the last set of documents, the ones that had taken the most work to obtain. These are your bank statements, Margaret, the ones you've been hiding. Would you like to explain to everyone why someone about to lose their house to foreclosure has over $2 million in offshore accounts? The crystal champagne glass slipped from Margaret's hand, shattering on the dining room floor. The crash seemed to echo in the stunned silence that followed. I can explain, she stammered, looking desperately around the table. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think, I said firmly. You've been lying to everyone for years. The medical bills you claimed were drowning you, paid in full by insurance. The second mortgage doesn't exist. You created this financial crisis to manipulate Ryan and me into selling our home, all because you couldn't stand the thought of us living somewhere you didn't choose. Ryan's voice was barely a whisper. Mom, is this true? Margaret turned to him, reaching for his hand. Darling, she's twisted everything. You know I would never. Stop lying, Mom, Ryan's voice cracked. Just stop, please. What happened next unfolded like a scene from a movie. Aunt Claire started crying. Uncle James began shouting about the money he'd been sending to help with Margaret's supposed medical bills. Grandmother Rose, who had been sitting silently throughout the whole exchange, slowly stood up. I've watched you manipulate this family for 40 years, Margaret, the elderly woman said, her voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. Ever since you married my son. I kept quiet because George loved you, but I won't stay silent anymore. She turned to me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I knew there was something special about you, dear. You remind me of myself at your age, someone who won't be bullied or manipulated. Margaret's carefully constructed world crumbled over the next hour as more truths came to light. Ryan's cousins revealed how she'd sabotaged their relationships, always under the guise of protecting the family. Aunt Claire admitted she'd nearly divorced Uncle James because of Margaret's meddling. By the time the police arrived, quietly called by Uncle James to report the break-in and document tampering, Margaret's true nature was exposed to everyone. She was led away in handcuffs, still protesting her innocence, while her perfectly decorated Christmas tree twinkled mockingly in the background. The aftermath was both easier and harder than I expected. The evidence I gathered was enough to press charges for breaking and entering, attempted evidence tampering, and fraud. Margaret took a plea deal rather than face a public trial, accepting house arrest and mandatory counseling. Ryan struggled with the truth about his mother for months, alternating between anger, grief, and guilt. We went to counseling together, working through the complex emotions of family betrayal. Slowly, our relationship grew stronger, built on a foundation of honest communication and shared understanding. Grandmother Rose, who turned out to be the actual owner of Margaret's house, decided to make things right in her own way. She transferred ownership of the property to Ryan and me with one condition. We had to promise to host family gatherings there, creating new traditions to replace the toxic ones Margaret had established. We accepted, but we didn't sell our own home. Instead, we renovated Margaret's house and turned it into a sanctuary for victims of domestic abuse and family violence. It felt right, transforming a place of manipulation and control into one of healing and hope. As for our wedding photos, we had a vow renewal ceremony on our first anniversary with Thomas Chen once again behind the camera. This time, every photo was backed up in multiple locations, and the album sits proudly on our coffee table, a reminder that sometimes the best memories are the ones we choose to make again. Margaret still lives in a small condo across town, allowed out only for approved activities under the terms of her house arrest. She sends cards on holidays, full of carefully worded apologies that never quite ring true. Ryan reads them, responds with brief but polite notes, and we continue building our life together. Last week, we hosted our first Christmas Eve gathering in the renovated house. The tree was smaller than Margaret's had been, decorated with homemade ornaments rather than color-coordinated glass balls. Children's laughter echoed through the halls, and nobody worried about using the wrong fork or offending family traditions. Looking around at our gathered loved ones, Ryan's cousins with their kids, Aunt Claire and Uncle James, Grandmother Rose dozing in her favorite chair, I realized something profound. Family isn't about maintaining appearances or controlling narratives. It's about creating a space where love can grow freely, where mistakes are forgiven but manipulation isn't tolerated, where each person is valued for who they are rather than how well they fit someone else's vision. As I watched Ryan teaching his little cousins how to make paper snowflakes, I placed a hand on my slightly rounded belly, our own little secret for a few more weeks. Soon we'd be adding to this beautifully imperfect family, creating new traditions and memories in this house of healing. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying someone else's world. It's about building something better from the ashes of their destruction. Margaret tried to control our story, but in the end, she only succeeded in helping us write a better one.